Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. In today's episode, my friend Jules and I review a vintage Leitz 2.8cm or 28mm f6.3 Hektor lens that was first introduced in 1935 and produced for 20 years until it was replaced with a new design. Less than 10,000 units were produced overall. As viewers and followers of this channel will know, I inherited a Leica IIIa at one point, and as part of the package came this wonderful 28mm Hektor lens with the original viewfinder and packaging and everything. And as collectors out there will know, this is quite a valuable package. Because for the viewfinder plus the lens, you can get up to 1,300 euros depending on the condition on the used market. And yet this lens also splits the community because there are many arguing, okay, it's not that great from an optical performance standpoint. And of course, you can get into the 28mm lens realm for significantly less money, starting at 250 euro, for instance, and you can also get really nice, beautiful, corrected modern lenses for, let's say, 800 euros or even lower. Jules and I took the lens through its paces, shooting primarily modern film stocks because we were curious how it would render and perform on these. So we shot some Ilford Delta 400 and some Kodak P3200 rated at 800. And of course, we also needed some faster film here in this wintry setting at the moment. So it made sense to have an ISO 800 film as well. And we also included some color images that we had taken earlier in our original test, some Kodak Portra 400 from the pandemic time, so to speak, to give you an idea of how it performs on color as well. So let's take a closer look at the construction, the optical performance, and where the name comes from. So what about the name, the construction and optical design of this lens? The Hektor name is quite unusual for Leica and allegedly goes back to the name of the dog of the legendary optical designer Max Barrick. And at first I was like, okay, this doesn't sound so plausible or more like an urban legend. And then I read a bit more about the story of Max Barrick and Oscar Barnack and how they started out. And Max Barrick joined the company only 1 year after Oscar Barnack and arguably significantly contributed to the success of the Leica cameras and complemented the ingenious designs of Oscar Barnack's cameras with fitting lenses. And one of the first lenses that he created was a 50mm f3.5 L-Max lens, with the EL standing for Ernst Leitz, so the company name, and Max, of course, referring to the first name of Max Barrick. And with that story in mind and seeing that it was actually introduced to the market as L-Max and then later changed to L-Mar as we know it today, it sounded suddenly a bit more plausible to me that Hektor actually refers to his dog's name and that this was just the way they named the lenses when they were starting out with their young enterprise of creating these small cameras and lenses. Today, of course, this is different, and you know the naming conventions back then, if you look at this list here, are much more confusing than what we have today, where typically a Zoomilux refers to a widest open aperture of f1.4 and a Zoomicron to an f2. Back then, if you look at this list here and where the Hektor shows up as well, you can see a lot of different namings and conventions, and also from a collector perspective, this is what it makes what makes it quite challenging, but also interesting, of course, to get a hang of it and understand the naming structure. Now back to the 28mm f6.3 lens, which also goes as Hoopy, by the way, in collector circle. And according to Dennis Laney, around 9,694 units were produced in the 20-year production time, which makes this lens not relatively rare, but still heavily sought after today. And the lens consists of 5 elements, so one single element surrounded by 2 cemented parts, as you can see here in the original drawings. The lens weighs 110 grams and is of course highly compact, and we will discuss the handling in a minute. The lenses slightly differ with respect to their material, coating and the aperture range. Early lenses were offered in nickel or in chrome, and the lens was only coated after the war around late 1945, and all lens versions until 1950 featured the European sequence on the aperture scale, so 6.3, 9, 12.5, 18 and then 25, and only about 1950 they started to adopt the international scale, which you can immediately see because it ends at 22. All models have 6 aperture blades. My lens here stems from the mid-1930s and therefore comes without coating and of course the European scale. And it was relatively expensive at the time, so it cost around, in today's US dollars, $1,200, so corrected for inflation and so on. And you could argue that it basically retained its value if you look at the used market, as long as you have one in good condition with original packaging and maybe even the viewfinder and other accessories. You can certainly get the 1,200 euros or even more. At the time, Leitz described the lens as quite a novelty, promising, quote, absolutely sharp negatives entirely free from distortion, unquote, and pointing out, quote, we wish to mention particularly that this lens also is coupled with a rangefinder, which has not been done before with lenses of this focal length, unquote. The manufacturer description also highlights the relatively wide open maximum aperture with f6.3 and yet points out that it works best at f11 in terms of optical performance. And I found this interesting because, of course, at the time the film speeds tended to be different, and it was hard to come by a really solidly performing ISO 400 film, for instance. This only slowly took off at the time. And if you look at it from today's perspective, of course, this lens is much more useful because you have access to faster films that still perform nicely or produce a really beautiful grain structure. And of course, access to digital cameras with typical a better ISO, low ISO, or high ISO and low light performance. And yet I found f11 quite limiting if you think of the optimum optical performance, but an f6.3, which we used in most of our images here, is still a pretty good middle ground, so to speak, to use it even when it's not completely bright outside and you have beautiful sun. If you do, of course, you can even use some slower speed films, and then the lens really performs nice as well. The lens may be used with either a 36mm slip-on filter, which was quite common at the time and for these kinds of lenses, or a 34mm screw-on. And there's also an original lens hood, which is a little bit crazy and known as Zone in collector circles, so SOOHN. And this sometimes becomes more expensive than the lens itself because it's so rare on the market and so hard to find that people are really looking for it, especially collectors who want to complement the entire package and have the original hood for it in a great condition as well. So what about the optical performance of the lens and how does it live up to what Leitz promised at the time? Overall, the images created with the 28mm Hektor have quite a vintage feel and charm to them, in my opinion. When shot wide open at 6.3, you do see quite some fall off and vignetting, and the sharpness is decent in the center, but it quickly deteriorates towards the corners. And it's certainly not on par with what you would expect from a modern lens or anything created after the 1970s, basically. The negatives from the Kodak P3200 rated at 800 came out pretty flat, or rather flat. And while scanning, I first was wondering, okay, is it so hard to get contrast the images out of these negatives because of the negatives, or is that related to the lens? And then when scanning the Delta 400 film, I realized, oh, because here I had shot some images with the 50mm Summicron that I own as well, and that came out significantly more contrasty. It also had a higher resolution, and I quickly realized, okay, it really comes down to the lens and how it renders. And I could confirm that when I passed on the negatives to Jules, asking him kindly to scan them on his Fuji Frontier, and he basically encountered the same issue, that the images just needed some work in order to bring out contrast. So by default, this lens is relatively low on contrast, and if that is your thing, of course it is interesting, but if you want to have some more contrast in your images, you certainly need to tweak them afterwards. Shot against the light, the lens produces quite some flaring and ghosting, which is not surprising given that it is not coded and not optimized for that, corrected for that at the time. If you appreciate that effect from an artistic perspective, of course, you can create some interesting results with it. And personally, I do like that. But if it's important to you that you are not limited by certain sun flares coming in and you still get nice contrast in your image, then this is not a lens for you. Color reproduction and saturation are surprisingly good or okay, as you can see here in our Kodak Portra 400 results shot in the early morning. But given the characteristics of this lens, it really shines, in my opinion, shooting black and white film. And I could also imagine using it on a Leica M monochrome with a really nice black and white sensor that also brings out the characteristics of this lens with a strong vignette and decent sharpness, but not really strong, sharp, modern rendering. So if you are in the market for an inexpensive 28mm lens for the Leica Thread Mount or Leica M mount, and you really want resolution, sharpness, and contrast, then this lens is certainly not for you. But if you are a collector or just curious about these special lenses, the early 1930s creations, coming from the Leitz factory in limited numbers, and you like the look and feel of the images, you also like the look of the lens, maybe on the M6 or other black cameras, or also here on the traditional Leica 3 series. They are really beautiful, of course, and if you don't mind the higher prices that you will pay because it's relatively rare, then it's certainly an interesting choice. So what about the handling and my personal impressions? Overall, I really enjoyed using this lens, especially on the Leica III series. You feel like the viewfinder and the lens were really made for this camera, and it complements the design in a beautiful fashion. And at least in my experience, it was quite a conversation starter when out and about, and accidentally coming across Leica collectors or people interested in Leica cameras. You immediately get into a conversation when carrying this lens and the viewfinder. I also really liked using it on my Leica M6 camera, because you can do without the viewfinder, thanks to the 28mm frame lines that every 0.72 magnification viewfinder will have. So not just the Leica M6, but of course other models as well. So you only need an adapter, in my case an URT adapter, which I have featured here on the channel before. And then the correct frame lines are automatically selected when attaching the lens. And thanks to the built-in light meter, I also liked the handling and exposing the film was much easier, because in most cases I just ended up selecting the aperture once in f8 or 6.3, and then adapting only the shutter speed to get correct exposure of my frame. And that of course is very convenient. It makes the lens also look easy in the handling, but also look nice on any kind of black Leica M camera. In terms of the handling, I really appreciated the focusing throw, the limited focusing throw, and buttery smooth focusing in general. There is a focus lock at infinity that can be released or unlocked pressing the focusing tab. And the only thing that I found a little bit a nuisance was that you basically need your fingernail in order to manipulate the aperture, and you have to be careful not to touch the glass of the lens itself when doing that. But other than that, it's a really, really nice compact lens, beautiful on the handling, and beautiful in terms of how it looks and feels on the camera. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Analog Insights and our review of the vintage Leitz 28mm f6.3 Hektor lens. A really interesting historical collector piece that is still valid as a lens and can still be used until today, even on the latest digital Leica M camera. And arguably its finest use case is on a black and white film on any kind of vintage Leica Thread Mount series, in my opinion. But it also works perfectly fine on a Leica M with a built-in viewfinder and the fitting frame lines. And of course, it's particularly well suited for shooting black and white film, in my opinion. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to like it and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Jules, Greg, and I really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.